you look at just foodstuffs alone, Russia and Ukraine are 30% of the world wheat supply, 20% of the corn supply, and 80% of sunflower oil. So it's often called the breadbasket of Europe, but it's really, really important source of raw materials for both food for people, but also for livestock, which then go on to feed people. So it's a really important region, and it's really important that we find a solution to enable those exports to come out of the ports, whether escorted or not, so that we don't end up with a major food security crisis much further across the world over the coming months.
Dr. John Rich, listening to that, I mean, it does really spell out how serious this problem is. I mean, how long can you store this grain?
Well, look, I think that there's two aspects to this. Firstly, what most people don't understand is that in the summer planting program that we've just completed, a lot of farmers have reduced the amount of corn, which normally would go to the EU and to the feed industry, and increased sunflower and soy oil. Definitely in-house, we've done that as one of the biggest producers. This is because of logistics. In other words, we can't see how we can export a large amount of corn into the region. So there's a change in planting which will have a material impact. But second thing, to your point, is that as I see it now, unless the crops are exported, we will have to minimise our planting program going into the winter. And so we just simply won't be able to plant if we can't store.
I'd like to bring in now Dr. Alessio Patalano, who is a Professor of War and Strategy at King's College London and also a Senior Fellow with the Royal United Services Institute. Good morning to you, Alessio.
Good morning.
We were hearing a little bit from our defence editor, Larisa Brown, earlier, but do you think there is a realistic military way of breaking this blockade?
Yes, there always is a military solution to a matter. The question is it desirable? And have we already reached the stage where that's the only option? And that's really the two questions that we would need to address first. And in particular, because what we have, part of this debate hasn't sufficiently engaged with three preliminary, very important aspects. Number one, if we are talking about resuming trade going outside, so from the Black Sea outwardly, then we need to engage with Turkey, we need to engage with the control of the Bosphorus, we need to make sure that the 1936 Montreux Convention is fully addressed, because that is one preliminary point. We can try to think about all the sorts of military solutions we want, but without the possibility to go through the Bosphorus, there is no solution at all. So the first thing to address is to engage with Turkey, and through Turkey with Russia, to ensure that this corridor can be put in place. The second element to this is speak to something that the IMO has already been engaged with. Ever since the beginning of this crisis, the International Maritime Organization has been very clear about the fact there's a number of cruise and tankers that are stranded. The natural implication, everything kind of stopped in the Sea of Azov and in the Black Sea. And the International Maritime Organization, ever since the beginning of March, has been calling about establishing a sort of something of a blue safe maritime corridor for humanitarian reasons. So the second point to address is, could this food shortage, because of the consequences that have been so well described moments ago, be put under that broader framework of a humanitarian corridor, which in a way would reduce the pressure on the military solution? Number three, and this is of no less sort of significance, Larisa talked very eloquently about the fact that you've got mines going on. In fact, IMO just a couple of days ago distributed a letter advising the fact that there's floating mines that have been sighted in the Black Sea. Frankly, if you go back in time, whether it is the Korean War, whether it is the Second World War and sort of ending party in Japan, mining happens when either the weaker side sees a fear of being sort of the coastline used for landing, opposed landing opportunities, or indeed, if in the case of the Russians, they see themselves in the weaker spot, they don't want anybody else to use it. So mines is a problem already, and it's likely to become an even more more significant problem. Okay. So the military solution for it to be found is not just about the convoys, but it's also about the safety. You can get the convoys in place, but you need to have the mining that allows those convoys to take the safety through the Straits of Bosphorus.
So if you did have some form of international agreement, perhaps an agreement at the UN, that that we have to get this stuff out for humanitarian reasons because of the effects it's having, not least on some of the poorest nations of the world. I mean, assuming that the Russians aren't going to agree to it because, they've said they'll only allow it if we lift sanctions, which is not going to happen. I mean, is the international community really going to take the sort of risks involved in trying to break this blockade?
I think given the situation where we are today, and I think both Nick and John, Chris and John pointed out quite eloquently, there is a clear awareness, whether you're a business community, whether you are the political community, at the international level, this is a major crisis. So I think pursuing the widest possible agreement in terms of the framework, here we have to disentangle the question from having a framework in place for allowing this to happen and who's going to implement it. And I think the perhaps one way to engage this is to try to find within the UN context a wider mandate in terms of humanitarian support that this would provide, and then sort of addressing the question of the implementation closer to home. And in this respect, you've got the UK, you've got the US, you've got France, and some of the major European and NATO partners. They've got both the mining capabilities as well as the experience. Let's not forget that Ernest Will, which is the last time that we had convoys in place in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war, this was very much a successful operation. We have that kind of expertise. We have that kind of willpower to do so. So I think in terms of the implementation, once the framework is in place, it would be perhaps easier to find people willing to take that kind of risk, given the wider agreement we have over the nature of this crisis.
Chris Southworth, just listening to that, do you think that this crisis is now of sufficient scale, that there should be that kind of international agreement, perhaps under the auspices of the United Nations, to say, look, this is having a huge global humanitarian effect?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Alessio's completely right on that. I think there is sufficient international interest in making this happen, and completely right on equipment and experience to also make it happen, particularly in NATO. Mention of the Gulf is a good example where there were escorted oil convoys going through the Gulf during that period of tension with Iran. So it is perfectly possible if the Russians agree. And I think we will see increasing international pressure, not just from the EU and US, but also from the developing countries who need the food. We should also point out here that in a food production economy, this isn't just about 2023 and going into the winter of 2022. Sorry, it's about 2023 too, right? 2023 and getting the right production lines so that we don't end up with a problem this winter and then a further problem or worsened problem in 2023. So it's really important that we tackle the issue now and work with our international partners, whether that's through the UN would probably be the most ideal solution, to try and open up that corridor to get the ships out.
And Dr. John Rich, from the biggest grain producer in Ukraine, I mean, do you get any sense that there is any movement on this? I mean, presumably you are saying to governments, not just in Ukraine, who of course are pretty hamstrung by the Russian blockade, but to saying to them that this is now getting urgent because presumably the time window for getting this stuff out is now narrowing.
I think the critical thing is that it will start impacting the 2023 program within 8 weeks. Okay, so this is a serious issue. Because we start preparing for that winter program and start sowing in October. So I think that this small phrase is eloquent enough to summarise the situation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Therein lies the problem. And I just don't see the flesh getting stronger without direct confrontation as it stands today.
Well, let's speak now to the Times defence editor, Larisa Brown. Good morning to you, Larisa.
Good morning.
Really good to have you with us. Just explain, first of all, exactly what is going on, which ports are being blocked and why is this having such a significant effect?
Well, yes, so obviously we've talked a lot about in the last 3 months Russia's failures, but one of their important strategic gains has been its ability to cut off Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. Now, analysts have said this morning that Russia has got two cruise missile carriers ready to strike from the Black Sea, and they've had a variety of ships in that area for quite a long time. And of course, this poses a problem for Odessa, which is obviously the main city where the Ukrainians were exporting grain. And so it's got a lot of ships stuck there that aren't able to get out and obviously export that grain to other countries that desperately need it. And so that's obviously the problem that Boris Johnson is trying to solve along with Zelensky and other countries around the world. But there's a lot of debate about how you could solve that. And one of those, of course, is to have this effective humanitarian corridor and bring in warships from NATO countries or other countries also.
But of course, that could be potentially quite, a risky operation. We're hearing that there are mines in the area, and presumably you'd have to have some form of agreement with the Russian warships which are in the area.
Absolutely. So I was speaking to the Lithuanian foreign minister last week, and he was really pushing this issue of the idea of countries getting together and agreeing to send ships that would then basically escort those humanitarian convoys out of the sea. And he sort of suggested that the Russians wouldn't then dare to attack those ships that would obviously be heavily armed. I did also speak to the British Ministry of Defence, however, after this, and it seems that they're pushing back on the idea that they want Royal Navy ships involved in this because it would be incredibly dangerous. They think that they wouldn't want to risk such an operation unless the Russians agreed to that, because they would obviously be very fearful that they could end up escalating things quite significantly and be involved themselves in a firefight with the Russians. Then there's also the problem with mines. The Ukrainians have laid mines around Odessa because they are obviously frightened of the Russian forces attempting a landing operation on the city. And so in order for a humanitarian convoy to take place, the Ukrainians would also have to demine the area. But of course, if they were going to do that, they would want Russian assurances that the Russians wouldn't then use that as an opportunity to try and take the city.
Yeah, and Russia's response is crucial. And as I understand it, we've had this response of, we could consider this if you lift sanctions, which is not something that any Western country is about to do anytime soon.
No, I don't think they are, and I think the sanctions that Russia would want to lift would probably be so extreme that it would never be palatable for countries such as Britain and European nations and the US. And so it doesn't seem like there is going to be an agreement anytime soon. We have obviously had the German Chancellor and the French President holding talks with Putin over the weekend. And the outcome of that was apparently Moscow said it was willing to sort of find ways to unblock those grain exports. But then other nations in Europe hit back and said that there shouldn't be negotiations with Putin. You can't trust him. If he says that he's going to allow a humanitarian corridor, is he really going to allow it? And is he just going to use that as an opportunity to invade Odessa and take further Ukrainian territory?
Dr John Rich is the chief executive of MHP, who's the biggest grain producer in Ukraine. Good morning to you, John.
Yes, good morning, Carole.
Really good to have you with us. We're going to bring in a moment Chris Southworth, who is the General Secretary for the International Chamber of Commerce. But let me ask you, first of all, to explain, how much grain is there? And is it literally stuck in warehouses at the moment?
Well, actually, at present, we have around about 20 to 25 million tonnes in storage, which is still waiting to be shipped. I think it might be at the end of May closer towards 20 million tonnes, but around that figure. Now, at present, our estimations for the wheat harvest, which we commence in approximately 4 to 5 weeks' time, is around about 20 million tonnes. Now, that's probably on the lower end because I'm being quite conservative, but let's say 20, 25 million tonnes of wheat. And then for the summer harvest, we're expecting about 35 million tonnes approximately. So in other words, around about 50% less than we compared to last year, which is a very exceptional year. But at present, total stock on hand plus what we can produce this year sits at around about 75 to 80 million tonnes. Now of that, normally we would use 20, 25 million tonnes of grain internally and the balance is exported. So therein lies the problem. The problem is that we're going to have 40 to 50 million tonnes of grain in storage, and the ability to export at present across rail is around about 1 million tonnes a month. And albeit that we've seen a lot of efforts by EU to try and improve the situation and increase that to 1.5, maybe 2 million tonnes a month, the numbers just don't stack, as you can see, because the big ports were responsible for shipping up to 80 million tonnes in a matter of months. And now we're in a situation of having the same amount and we can only export maybe at max 15 million tonnes per year across the borders.
So this would normally be put onto ships and taken, out of Odessa or other ports as well?
Exactly. And at present, there's 89 ships still tied up around the Odessa region with grain still on them. So and a lot of the storage in the Odessa area is already full. So at present, the system's full. There's only one good thing, and that is that normally Ukraine has about 75 million tonnes of storage. At present, we have available about 60 million. In other words, 15 million tonnes been lost in the war. So we still can store the grain. Technically, at present, we can store our crops at present, but we just can't export them. And therein lies the big problem. And I was just in Morocco last week, and they've got the worst drought for many, many years. It's a very, very serious situation for the MENA region.
Let me bring in Chris Southworth, who is General Secretary for the International Chamber of Commerce. Good morning to you, Chris.
Good morning.
We're hearing there about the phenomenal amounts of grain that are stuck in and around Odessa. How is this affecting international exports and international supplies?
Well, I think it's affecting the international trade economy in sort of three ways. First of all, it's further risk to the economic recovery, more supply chain disruption, more inflation, more impingement and hampering of the finance system too. It's also hampering the supply of raw materials. We've heard about wheat, barley, corn, and rapeseed, but also aluminium, iron, nickel. Fertilizers are a really big one, and oil and gas, obviously, we've heard a lot about that. And then thirdly, trade routes. We've heard about the seaports, but it's also about the airports and land ports. The airspace is closed, and then Ukraine provides an important land bridge between Europe and Asia Central, and then across the seaports is the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, provide important sea routes. All of those are blocked at this current time. Just to put some flavor on that, where this is reaching across the economy, the cost of fertilizer for Thailand rice has gone up 30%. Indigenous Ecuadorian communities have had their exports of shrimp, banana, and flowers stopped because they can't access finance. John has just flagged up the MENA region, but we've also got severe food shortages down the Horn of Africa as well. So Africa is likely to be heavily impacted, and where there is a real need for food. And then closer to home, milk prices are up 25%. And of course, the less fertilizer there is, the less food stock there is for animals. All of that puts increased pressure on living costs.
So it's really having a global effect. Are there particular countries that are being worst affected by this, or is it the squeeze that it puts on global supplies more widely?
Well, if